Welcome to Trauma Training Tuesday. Thank you so much for being here. We're really, really excited to have such a powerful topic. Um, March is Women's History Month. And one thing I have definitely learned from being a clinical social worker, being in practice, is that there's not much that derails people's lives more than abuse and assault. Um, I know so many women that had great plans for themselves and then they were victimized and it derailed them. This is one of the biggest manifestations of sexism, of the patriarchy. Um, and we're zooming in on the legal system part of this. I think a lot of us want to believe that the legal system is there to get justice for victims, and that's really hasn't been the case for our guests today, at least, and really for no one. But we'll get to that. I'm delighted to have Heather Prunier and Lynn Key here in my living room.
Hey guys,
Hi.
Thank
And
you for joining us.
the amazing Melanie Lynn Brown. She's at her home, not in Rutland today, but we're so grateful she's here. She's going to be the mistress of our slide deck. And there's so much content here. I'm just going to zip it and hand it on over.
Oh, it's kind of, I was trying to admit somebody, I'm sorry. We're going to go back. So thank you, Amy. Just wanted to start by giving an overall agenda. Obviously that was Amy. Most of you, I'm sure, probably know her, obviously, from Worcester Acts. I'm going to start with just giving a very basic overview of the problem. Obviously, we are limited on time, and this is a huge conversation. So we're going to be, it'll be an incomplete conversation in a lot of ways. Then I'll briefly tell you my story, how I got into trauma work. And then Heather takes a stand. She's gonna share with you about her story. Um, and I won't say too much about that. I'll just let their stories speak for themselves. And again, after Heather will be Lynn. They have both been dealing with the trauma of trying to have their perpetrators held accountable for many years. And there's a lot of problems and nuances that they'll both be discussing. Then I'm going to go into a little bit more of the body, mind, and what health is, and our understanding of what trauma does, especially in the body, because in my view, we really understand that trauma is as much your biology as it is your psychology, right? That's not the mainstream conversation all the time. And then we wanted to leave some time for questions and discussion. Okay. So the little thing on obviously on the corner of your screen over there to the right is it's just like it's a great, I love the count of the breath. It's kind of like a shorter in and longer out. And obviously that like calms down the system. I just put that up there. Obviously, everybody comes to Trauma Tuesdays. They know that the conversations are going to be difficult. So just make sure to take care of yourself. Um, thank you. All right, so just a very, very quick story, my personal story. When in 2013, I self-designed a master's in education in trauma at Lesley University. It was in their social entrepreneurship program. Uh, I was awaiting the verdict in a court case that I'd argued for a year and a half. It was a housing case, and I'll explain that in a second. And it was about 3 years after I had been displaced from domestic violence. So before that, and this is really important because it's so connected to my work, when I was 15 years old, I kind of was given a page out of a book called Prescription for Nutritional Healing, and it was a page on depression. And I was coming from a very hard situation, and I could not believe it. I was blown away. It's like an encyclopedic type of book that teaches you all about nutrition, herbalism, lifestyle practices, exercise, fasting, things that are very, very common. But this was back in '93. So I was fascinated. You mean what I eat and what I do affects my mood and my mental health? Like I was blown away. So ever since then, I've been fascinated with psychology, how we work, and those kinds of things. So I'm a whole health educator. My undergraduate degree is in government. I also had a focus in psychology. I was a high school teacher originally. And so I've always been in education, but I've always kind of been on the cusp of really paying attention to how our emotional quotient, which was something that was talked about a lot in the 90s, is very determinative of, you know, living the best life that we would prefer to live and being more empowered. I am primarily an educator and I do work on policy, but then I do take a couple of clients at a time in this approach called in being alive therapy. Kind of happened accidentally because if we think about where we get health information and health narratives, it's usually being sold at us. And so people are kind of hungry for that honest information without an agenda. And we kind of work through psychological patterns. And so that's a little bit of what I do as well. So while I am here today, not to take too much time. So in 2013, I designed this degree and I had started learning about trauma because I really didn't understand what had happened at the end of my marriage. I had not been living in an abusive relationship. There was no power differential because it's not just physical abuse. People, not enough people get that part. But so it was a shock and awe. And he was very unwell. And now I know he was having abandonment trauma. He was a childhood victim of an attempted patricide, right? So I was in awe and our life just kind of exploded. And we lived in, my son and I went into hiding in shelters. We lived in 8 places for 2 years, very ungrounding time. So as I started to went to grad school, I got certified as a yoga teacher. I studied practically, all the embodiment, all the healing. I've continued to try to learn. And as I started learning about trauma, getting introduced to what was happening beyond just like nutrition and the things that you can see under blood scans and things like that, I wanted everybody to know because like I'm a teacher. I'm like, why doesn't everybody know this stuff? I had taught psychology in high school and I've been studying it forever. Um, and I didn't know about all of the biological pieces, but I'd always been fascinated with the body. So, anyways, that's basically me. So I train, I work in policy, and then I'm getting to the harder part of the conversation here, where I'm just starting to talk about this more publicly. 2020 hit and it was COVID. And of course, there was an incredible interest in trauma all of a sudden. So I went from, wait, you're a therapist? Wait, what do you do? No, I'm a psychoeducator. I'm an educator. This is Delane. And I went from years of trying, volunteering everywhere and slowly building a reputation. And overnight, the whole world woke up to trauma. Um, I'm not much of a techie. I didn't have like a major media presence. That wasn't the thing for me. It was just kind of organically happening here in Boston. But it was about 5 months into the pandemic, one of my closest friends assaulted me, and he had a pretty strong political organizing power in Massachusetts. And as we people who are, watching this kind of presentation are probably aware, it's really hard to trust after you've been through some traumatic experiences. So it takes a lot to trust somebody. And so at that point, he had been my friend for several years at that point, and he was a very trusted friend, and we had very clear boundaries. Um, what happened next was I was doing some part-time work for the nonprofit that he was the executive director of. So when I filed charges, there had to be an HR investigation. So to make this as short as possible, because we have so much to cover, when I reported, and I met with the ADA told me I had a strong case. When the 700-person international law firm was hired by this struggling nonprofit to investigate, they basically created an unreal fictitious document, and there's just so many details to that that bears no relationship to what happened. So because of this brand interest, this nonprofit that wanted to protect their reputation, it was, first of all, it was not a legally sanctioned investigation, but they can produce um, an HR report like that, and that's all they have to do. The ADA said all this man X has to do is testify, and now we have reasonable doubt because of fictitious things put in the document, that text taken out of context, also whatever, it was fiction. So, um, having your career disrupted for a couple of years, displaced from domestic violence, and then when something you are so passionate about and sacrifice. So when I was, my thesis was on embodying compassion in teaching, right? It was based on the ways that bodies communicate with each other beyond verbal and beyond words. It's so much more about the body, and that gets complicated. But that was what I was focusing on. My teacher, the state of the teacher, to put it like really simply, how can that affect learning? How can a teacher's presence and behaviors affect student achievement? Was a real focus at the time. So I was I worked in about 60 different Boston schools at that time as a per diem teacher when I had been a full-time teacher, which was an incredible financial sacrifice after an incredibly disorienting time. When I started grad school, I was waiting for a housing verdict because when you get displaced, you don't have a steady job. You lose your income, your credit gets destroyed. And so I had no choice but to rent from a slum landlord. And that becomes a very big story where I'll share more because I don't want to take too much time. But in that process, the ineffect there's who is in our government matters a lot. And that part was made incredibly difficult, and I was incredibly unsafe because of city officials. Um, Getting to back to the 2020 here, to condense it a little bit more, at a time when my work should have exploded, right? This was the work. This is like, people need to understand this is so important. I had no ability to put myself out there. I had no ability to put myself out there. I wanted to just like hide and move up, and that will make more sense. It will make sense for people who are watching this right now, but as we learn more about what trauma does to you. So I don't want to take too much time with that story. Um, but for the past couple of years, when I started getting recovering and kind of getting more perspective, distance will give you perspective. I got really angry. So the worst thing that can happen in a trauma is to have it not validated, right? Which is one of the reasons that sexual violence, which is rarely held accountable, is such an extreme trauma. Because if somebody gets murdered, it's visible. If somebody is hit, it's often denied, and there's a lot of rape myths. And we'll continue to go into that. But for now, another piece that becomes kind of important is that because of the use of NDAs in the state of Massachusetts and some other some history of that being a relatively very large story a couple years prior, I was asked to contribute to a Globe story um, about the sexual predation and the cover-up in Massachusetts. And I was in conversation with several people, and um, yeah, I mean it's such a big story, but it was one of the most demoralizing things. I decided not to do the Globe story at the time. I didn't want to be out there. But now I'm starting to speak about the things that happened at that time and how, and this is Women's History Month, so internalized misogyny is a real problem. Two female politicians knowingly held a rally, knowing that with the man in pursuit of their own interest and their own attention, um, despite knowing a woman had filed against him. All right, so moving on. So that is just like the basic of my story, condensed really, really small because I want to leave lots of time for Heather and Lynn here. So what is trauma? So hopefully people who are coming here have some scope of trauma. People have, different definitions, but essentially trauma is in Greek is wound. It's a wound, right? So we hear about trauma surgeons, right? There's a wound to the body, but we can get wounded psychologically, and as we'll reference later, our psychological or our social wounds can have like physiological consequences and create disease. Quick overview, different types of sexual assault, and this becomes important in the law because there's different legal definitions by state, and that becomes important when legislation changed where it didn't have to be coerced, like physical violence or very specific language can determine, outcomes in cases. Um, so we can need unwanted sexual touching, forced sexual acts, penetration without consent, drug facilitated assaults, intimate partner assaults, assault within marriage. Those are all sexual assault. And again, the legal definitions vary by state. So over here, let me put that over there. All right, so just a really quick overview. Some of the stats in sexual violence research and work are difficult to kind of pin down because not everybody discloses, and not everybody like is ready to disclose. Maybe they're going to disclose 10 years from now. It's quite common. It's very common for women, especially because there's a hormonal thing that goes along with this. That's kind of fascinating. Often won't disclose until like middle age. It's a very, very common thing to disclose, and that it can be true for men as well. Um, I just was starting with women because there's actually a biological reason that, and there's a cascade that happens when women go through hormonal changes in the menopause era that actually invite a sensitivity to feeling the trauma of the past. So the way I like to think about trauma is, and you can look up a lot of like different ways that people talk about it. I like to think about it as the residue. It's kind of the stuff that gets stuck in your body um, that you don't process. So really, really great way to quickly think about trauma is to think of the basic mammalian. If people are familiar with Peter Levine's work, um, when an animal in the woods gets startled, they often freeze, right? What's happening in the body is you've got adrenaline and all sorts of stress hormones building up. They freeze to evade the predator. When the predator goes away and they're safe, they shake it out. Literally, I have actually watched an adult male shake this out after a big upset. People would naturally do that if we were living more in our embodied selves, because that's what our mammalian selves need. They need to shake that out. So after major traumatic events, movement of some kind is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And one of the worst things you can do is actually subdue it unless it's needed for harm reduction, meaning like a calm the system down with a medication. It's better to walk around to release that so you don't keep it and it doesn't become part of your calibration. So, not to get too far into that, the scope of the problem here, and this is in the United States, for every 1,000 sexual assaults, only 310 go reported to law enforcement, right? So we're looking at about 69% of those 100 sexual assaults. 50 will lead to arrest, so that's about 5%. 28 result in conviction, so that's about 2.8%. And then out of the 28, 25 perpetrators are sentenced to incarceration. That little point oh 0.03 is kind of an interesting number to me because that is where there has been a conviction and the sentencing has been determined that that person wasn't going to have jail time or it wasn't no jail time, but one of the most well-known cases of judge judicial discretion was the Chanel Miller out in California case where she went through the trial. The person was caught by two other people. This is the Brock Turner. You can, look it up if you're interested. And then was only sentenced to 6 months after she went through years of dealing with the legal system, right? So those cases exist too often. Additional risk factors, obviously every vulnerable population, and the intersectionality that comes with that is present in our legal system everywhere. Excuse me 1 second. That would be a fire alarm in my building. Um, just 1 second. I'm gonna put my headphones on if we can just, of course. Excuse me, just 1 minute. Oh my God.
No problem, Melanie. Take
Maybe you
care of
can.
yourself. Yeah. I'm also noting the chat's available. I'll be responding to you in there. If anybody wants to jump in or ask any questions as we go, the chat's open. Kind of quiet this morning, this afternoon.
Um, all right, so I think we're okay. It's in the distance now. Can we hear that? Can you guys hear that or? Okay, good. Um, I guess I am kind of throwing a lot at you, maybe too much too fast. So please, absolutely, let me know if there are questions as we go. But as I was kind of going over, obviously we can expect that there's more vulnerable people to assault. Um, Unreal statistics is American Indians first Native Native Americans are twice as likely, Native women, to experience rape or sexual assault compared to all races. Twice as likely. That's just such an unreal statistic that we should all be paying attention to. That gets complicated because part of it is obviously racism and history. Part of it has to do with jurisdictional coverage of different areas and it being the responsibility of this department or tribal uh, tribal tribunal. I'm not sure what it's called. The name's escaping me at the moment, but the police force on tribal lands, right? individual with psychiatric or any other form of different ability of twice the rate of victimization. Um, Obviously, because of history, BIPOC people, people of color engaging with the policing in our country is problematic, and that's one of the reasons we think that the statistics for women of color are lower, than what's really happening. And of course, some of the most vulnerable women right now, like in our society, because of what's happening are undocumented women. The likelihood that an undocumented woman would report her assault is quite low, right? It's always where there is power, there's going to be the greatest vulnerability, but sexual assault happens in all socioeconomic classes, regardless of education, all of those things. But we're just talking about additional vulnerability, clearly. And of course, who are the most vulnerable people in this society? Children, right? 1 out of 6 boys will be assaulted, will be sexually abused in some capacity before the age of 18. One, 1 out of 3, it depends on the stat that you look at, 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 girls will be assaulted. So moving on here, just a super quick overview of some of the history, right? I don't want to take too much time. This is just a soft scrape, but we really need to consider how this crime has always been thought about. And there's just been these tinkering with reform throughout the years, right? So for the first couple hundred years for most of the history of the United States, rape has been defined as a property crime, right? So obviously, there is extreme sexual violence in the history of slavery in this country. Excuse me 1 second. And my apologies. Can you? Sorry about that. So whereas so obviously it's like women have been viewed as something to be consumed as a property, and that's a big reason that this crime is not taken very seriously. And the history of why it has not been taken very seriously has everything to do with power, patriarchy, hierarchy, white supremacy, all of those things. A couple of important things that start to be interesting to pay attention to. So you've got like the 1700s up until there start to be some reforms in the 60s, but they still keep the rape exemption. Well, you really start to see change in the 70s with the women's movement, right? So you start to see laws against marital rape happen. We see in 1978, I'm not sure what is looking like on you guys' screen. 1978 was the Rape Shield Law, which was enacted to protect the sexual history of the victim from being allowed into as evidence in a case. So the first marital rape conviction was in 79. Then you get to the 90s, and this is when the federal government actually top down, and this is a little different for the way these things usually work because all of the other sexual a lot of the 70s where the sexual assault laws were passed, kind of throughout the states. That's really when they reformed laws to some degree. Then you see in the 90s is where the sex offender registry board is what it's called in Massachusetts is created, and it starts on the top down of like some outline in 94, then to 96 there's a federal mandate that each state has to have some sort of registry, right? And so we see that take effect. Now this stat just floored me when I first learned it about a year ago. It wasn't until 2013 that the federal government defined sexual assault to include that included males in sexual assault. There was no definition of rape to include male victims until 2013. Like that was the year I started my grad program, right? So we always think this is so far in the past, and that's a really important thing to stay mindful of, that most of the legislation that allows people not to be treated like property, that anything can be done to them, for women, for white women, it came more in the 70s. Yeah, sorry, I forgot my thought there. Apparently, there's another fire coming. Oh. So I am just going to pass this off to Heather. And Heather, I just recently met, and she's an incredible warrior who has been engaging with not only the justice system, but power in communities for such a long time. And so, like, so we don't, so we can hear her voice and her story, I'm just going to pass it off. And Heather, if you want to take it over.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I really appreciate all that background and all those laws and dates and definitions. That's so helpful. I wanted to start by talking about the Epstein files. So obviously you can't listen to news at all right now without hearing about the Epstein files. As survivors of sexual assault or sexual abuse, every time that is brought up in the news, every time we talk about it, that can be triggering and traumatizing to survivors, re-traumatizing. You can't get away from talking about sexual assault right now. It is everywhere. It has always been everywhere, but right now it is in the news everywhere. And it is just so interesting to me, having been fighting this fight for 30 years, how much the national mirrors the state, mirrors the local, all the way down. They are the same. I have been trying to get accountability and some form of justice, which I don't really know that I believe exists in this country, for any survivors of sexual assault or abuse, for 30 years. I was sexually abused by a man who was my softball coach, but he was also a principal in the Worcester Public Schools from the ages of 9 to 12 while I played on his softball team. I disclosed in 7th grade. So when I was 13, I disclosed to a teacher at Forest Grove Middle School. It was 51A was filed with, at the time, DSS. And I talked to DSS. Shockingly, I did not feel comfortable talking to this random stranger that I'd never met before about the most intimate details of my life. So I didn't tell them anything because I was too traumatized. Fast forward a year, I disclosed again, and another 51A was filed. I did speak to DSS at that time. I spoke to the police. I spoke to the district attorney's office. There was about a 6-week investigation by the police and the school department. So he was put on administrative leave, paid administrative leave, for that 6 weeks. After that, he was welcomed back in the school, which I am told is at the school district's discretion. And at the time, the superintendent of the Worcester Public Schools allowed him to go back in and be a principal for, I don't even remember, 6 or 7 more years. And then he was on the school committee for 16 years. Anyhow, going back to the reporting. So we went through this, my parents, my family, all of us went through this process. I tried to commit suicide a number of times. I was self-harming. I had to go live in a residential, children's residential home for about a year. I left school. I never went back to the Worcester Public Schools after leaving in December of my freshman year. So it was, all of it was traumatic and triggering. And then in September of 1998, so this all happened in 1997, the spring of 1997. In September of 1998, my parents, after the Worcester District Attorney's Office said we declined to prosecute this case, were incredible advocates for me, and went to the Attorney General's office of Massachusetts, who at the time was Scott Harshbarger. They spoke to an assistant attorney general, and she sent a letter to the Worcester District Attorney's Office saying, we'd really like you to take another look at this, and sort of the behind the scenes, not written statement was, if Worcester doesn't do this, then the Attorney General's office will prosecute this case. So in September of 1998, I gave a 6-hour deposition to a uniformed, armed male police officer. It was supposed to be a plainclothes female officer, but that was changed for lots of reasons. The Assistant Attorney General was there for that deposition, and she requested that it be recorded. Generally, things like that are recorded, especially now with children, so that they don't have to testify in front of a grand jury. At the time, there was not the same interview, the sexual assault interview that they have now for children. So I had to meet with everybody separately instead of meeting as a team. So they asked to have it recorded. The Worcester Police Department and the Worcester District Attorney's Office declined to have it recorded because of some prior agreement. And the district attorney in Worcester waited until November when a new attorney general was elected, and we lost all of our contacts in Worcester, at the attorney general's office, and they refused again to prosecute. So that at that point, I had attempted suicide at least twice, maybe 3 times, and was living in a residential and was going to a therapeutic day school. It was too much for me, for my family, for all of us to continue to try to get any kind of justice from the legal system. So we dropped that part of it. Everyone in Worcester knew who I was and knew who had made these accusations. It was Worcester's worst kept secret. Every single person who worked in the Worcester Public Schools heard about this from their colleagues. Don't leave your children alone with this person because this is what he does. There were 3 teachers who came forward at the same time that I disclosed, who were willing to join my case, but they couldn't join my case because I was a minor and they were not. So instead, it is our understanding that the school system promoted them and moved them somewhere else. So there were, I certainly wasn't trauma-free or trigger-free for the next 10 years. Everything continued. I had non-epileptic seizures. All kinds of things. But around the time I met my husband, I was sort of like, everything I've done or tried to do, or anything that all of us have tried to do, has not gotten us anywhere. And so I'm just going to forget about this because that seems doable and like a good plan. And so I just sort of stopped talking about it for a while, for 8 years or so. My then partner and now husband and I got married. We bought our first house 3 days before we had our first child. And I had an incredibly traumatic birth with my son. I had either a placental abruption or a vasa previa and hemorrhaged, and we both almost died. So after about 2 years of everyone telling me I needed to go to therapy again for birth trauma, I agreed to go. I dealt with that birth trauma for a year before I told my therapist that there was any other trauma in my life. And then we started dealing with the sexual abuse again. Melanie, can you go back one slide? I'm sorry. So I started going to school committee in 2018 for exposure therapy because he was still on the school committee, and I wanted to take my city back. I felt like I couldn't go anywhere within Worcester because I was afraid that I was going to see him everywhere I went. I sit facing the door. I am hyper vigilant. I look for him everywhere I go. Anyone I think looks even remotely like him sends me into a panic attack. So I started going to school committee to try to start breaking myself of that hypervigilance. I like to say, I hope that we were part of the reason that he did not run for re-election in 2021. He did try to get us thrown out of the public meeting that is school committee by Maureen Benenda, his good friend. And then I was like, you know what? I want to know what happened. I want to know why things didn't proceed. I want to know how this is not going to happen again. Because the reason that I disclosed in the first place was so that it would not happen to other children. I was sure that it would, and it probably did. But I want to know, as an adult with a child in the Worcester Public Schools at the time, under the superintendent Maureen Benenda, who was actively covering for my abuser, I wanted to know how that was going to be different now if something like this happened than it was when it happened to me. So I started trying to get my files. I had been trying to get my files from Worcester, from different departments within Worcester, for 2 years. I did finally get 22 pages of a 78-page police file from the Worcester Police Department in October of 2025. It is very far, from the entirety of the file. I have tried to get my files from the district attorney's office. There were lots of emails and files back and forth between the mayor and the city manager and the solicitor and the police department and the school system and the police department in the 90s, and then again in the last 8 years. So I want all of that correspondence and all of those files. So I started also talking to a journalist about if we could make this story public. We started meeting in about 2019. In 2021, he had a story that was ready to go, but I was unwilling to be named. And his lawyer said, you can't publish that because you have too much liability. So we decided to hold off on that. He did publish in 2023, October of 2023. And I felt like it was my story again. I felt like this was my narrative, that I got to tell what happened, that I got to use my voice to bring awareness to this issue, that I got to say out loud to the people in power who hurt me and potentially other people that they had caused harm. And that was the beginning of being able to tell my story as my story, as a story of power and not as a story to be ashamed of. I still struggle with that. It is not easy for me to tell the story, but I want other people to know that that you can tell your story, that it is yours, you own it, right? It is not somebody else's decision to get to tell what happened to you or because of why or any of those things. Nobody else gets to tell your story. You get to tell it. And if you don't want to tell it out loud, don't tell it out loud, but own that story in yourself, because being able to make it yours and to own that gives you so much power back. I know I'm using the same words, but I don't know what else to say. If you can go to the next slide, Melanie, please. Thank you. So because of my article that came out in October of 2023, Lynn, sitting over here, was also working with a different reporter talking about the Sex Offender Registry Board and the trauma of interacting with institutions and systems. He sent her the article that Bill Shaner wrote, and she sat in her driveway and read it and cried and was like, this is the same thing, different, but the same. And so after a number of months, we were able to connect. And as an adult, I have a big support system, and I am so incredibly grateful for every single person who shows up to what I call the coven, and goes to school committee with me and goes to the vigils that we hold and all of these kinds of things. But I never, as an adult, have had someone who sees and understands what I am going through on a daily basis as I have since I met Lynn. And that has been life-changing. And so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. After the article came out in October, that March, my abuser was invited to read at Midland Street School in Worcester, Massachusetts. Obviously, that's where we all are. So he read to a kindergarten class. None of the parents were told ahead of time. They only found out because there was a picture that the then principal shared on social media or on Parent Square. I mean, like, kids know so much, right? We don't give them enough credit for what they know. And one of the kindergartners in the class came home and told her mother, a really creepy man came and read to us today. And she said, he only gave hats to the girls and to none of the boys. Isn't that weird? And like, the fact that we are teaching our children now, right? Consent, that we're teaching them that they own their body, that nobody else does, that you can use your words and your voice and tell people when you're uncomfortable or something feels weird. Thank God, because then you get to hear those things and stop things before they happen. After the same day that happened, I got a call from then Superintendent Dr. Rachel Menares, and she was like, I'm so sorry. And I said, for what? And she said, oh, you didn't hear. He was allowed to read in the Worcester Public Schools. And she worked with the legal department in Worcester, in the Worcester Public Schools, to get him banned from any Worcester Public School property in perpetuity, which was so incredible. So thank you. So yeah, then I have, in the interim between then and now, I've been meeting with the district attorney's office and the attorney general's office, with the police department, obviously. Some friends and I, supporters and I, met with the district attorney's office in November, and the head of the sexual assault unit said, our records person is working on your file, which I understand is rather large, and trying to go through as much as they can and redact whatever they have to so they can get it to you as soon as possible. A month and a half later, the district attorney's formal response to my pro bono lawyers from the Harvard Law Clinic, shout out right there, was that they have no responsive records. And the search terms were my name at the time, my name now, and his name. So either they're lying or they destroyed the record between November 5th and when we requested it. All of this, every single time I say, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can do this. And every single time I think, if I just do the next right thing, then it will be okay. And that is what I have been doing for the last 8 years, is taking the next step that feels like the right thing. Along the way, I have had a lot of anxiety and panic and dissociation and flashbacks and all of those things. Making sure that I check in with myself, that I have therapy, that I move my body, which I'm not doing right now, so I really need to get on that. That I sleep well. All of those things make such a huge difference in how I'm able to cope day to day with a household, with a family, with trauma, all of those things. And the support of the Coven, thank you to all of you. And the greater Worcester community, after that 2023 article came out, the outpouring of love and support and understanding shocked me because of how different it was in the 90s. I feel like we could start to live in a Worcester where kids matter, where women matter, where the power structure that does not always have to be, and where the people can take some of that accountability and and power back. That is my hope for Worcester. And I think that's it. I don't have another slide, right? Melanie?
I love too that slide is a picture of you at the age that you
Yes,
were.
it is.
It's such a powerful reminder. This did not happen to a grown woman. This happened to a child in school.
Right.
A 9-year-old child.
A 9-year-old child.
Yep.
Yeah. So better Worcester, that's your goal.
Better Worcester.
Better Worcester. Better world.
That's right.
Anyway, that's a good place to start. Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing so honestly, and being your authentic self and just putting your truth out there. In this world that we live in, people are very afraid to do that for many, many different reasons. And right now is a particularly difficult time. So it's pretty cool to see you standing in your power and reclaiming your story and sharing it for the betterment of others. It's just awesome. My name is Lynn Key. I'm a friend of Heather's. I came to
can you hear?
No, I'm good. Can you hear me, guys? I'm loud. You want me to talk louder? No? Okay. So I came to know Heather in about 2023. In or around 2023. And by know her, what I mean is know of her. At first, it was just an article that I read, as she said, in my driveway. It took me 45 minutes to read because I was crying so hard. I really identified with her experience of being abused by a teacher and coach. I really identified with her experience dealing with the legal system. And I don't call it the justice system anymore. It's taken me a while, but there is no justice there. It's the legal system. So anyway, Heather and I, came to know each other after that in person through a series of emails and then, a series of texts and then a meeting that I think we maybe even rescheduled a time or two.
Probably.
And after the holidays, around February of 2024, we got to meet in person. And I, too, have never felt more seen. Again, particularly her experience with the legal system and the lack of justice that she found there really resonated with me, as both my sister and I are survivors of childhood sexual abuse. My sister, unfortunately, has since passed from the end results of her trauma, which in her case was an overdose. She actually passed in January of 2023. So the same year that I came to know of Heather. I'm not going to get into too much detail, other than to just say that when I was speaking to law enforcement and the district attorney's office in Middlesex County, it was around the same time that Heather was, a year or two later. It was the early 2000s, in or around 2001, early 2002. The Catholic priest scandal had not happened yet. It was an incredibly difficult experience for me. My sister was victimized a year later. Her experience was similar. She was new to it, obviously, and it was not an easy process. Both of us struggled in the course of the process, but we did later secure convictions. It took me 2 trials, as there was a mistrial, the first trial, because one juror would not vote guilty after 3 days of deliberations. In my sister's case, unfortunately, her offender ran from the courthouse at his conviction and was gone. A convicted child rapist, a violent convicted child rapist, was allowed to, when he was told the jury was coming back with a decision, go downstairs unattended to pray. And when he did not come back up in the 20 minutes he was given to do so, the judge gave him another 20 minutes. And only then, when they did not see him, did they issue the Amber Alert. So I could get into a lot more related to that, but let's just say he was caught by America's Most Wanted. That's a story. Shout out to my mom on that one, because she's the one that wrote the letter that got them involved. But yeah, we both secured convictions. We come from a family of public servants. My father was the fire chief in Ashland for a very long time. He's also in the military. We were taught to believe in justice. We were taught that our system worked for us, and that if we told the truth would prevail. And, you know, that happened. We were not told what it was going to feel like or what it was going to take to get there. And that was incredibly traumatic. For me personally, over the years, my experience with the legal system has been more traumatic than my rape. I'll say that again. My experience with our legal system has been more traumatic than being raped at a 14-year-old mark. Like, I was 14 and that happened. But the legal system is more difficult to deal with, is more traumatizing. Yeah. And so that I don't get trauma brain, let me just take a breath. I was a pretty straight edge kid coming up. I actually wanted to be a lawyer. But when, after I reported my abuse, I was not the same. I actually was not the same when the abuse started, and people noticed, but they didn't know what was going on. It was to the point where I couldn't get out of bed, didn't want to take care of myself, and ultimately started abusing drugs, early on with marijuana, later with other things, and dropped out of high school to preserve my GPA, which I was told at the time I was first in my class. So that was like, thanks. I appreciate that as I drop out. But yeah, long story short, I did not have a good time. My sister followed a very similar path. She was also re-victimized years later by her boss at work in the town of Hopkinton. That will come into play later. Yeah. So at various times in my life, I have been addicted, and at other times, I have been full bore going towards my career or whatever else I'm trying to accomplish. And it's always one or the other. I've never been able to achieve balance. A little over 4 years ago, I finally found a way out of that. I was able to get clean, and I have been clean ever since. It is the single most difficult thing I've ever done, but by the time I got there, I was done with the drugs. The drugs were not working for me. I needed a better solution. I didn't know what that solution was, but I knew I was going to find it. And when I found it, I've just built off of it. Unfortunately, at the same time, my sister's life was unraveling. She was heavily addicted. She lost her children to DCF. My youngest niece went with my father. Her twins, who were 11 at the time, went into the system because he was unable to take them. And I would not take them at 3 months clean. I felt that would be incredibly irresponsible, and said that we'd revisit when I hit a year. We did revisit, and that's nothing did, because DCF is arguably the reason my sister is no longer here. That's a story for another day. Anyway, so her life was devolving as I was clawing my way out of addiction. I was at that point determined, in a way I've never been determined before, to get well for my nieces and nephew. That was my entire focus. Obviously, I had chosen to get well for myself, but you know, I needed to be the role model that my nieces and nephew deserved, and that was like the thing that I kept my eye on. That was the prize I was running towards. About 3 months into my sobriety, I went to church, And I went to church at a church that I belonged to in Hopkinton, Massachusetts, since I was 12 years old. And it was Maundy Thursday, which is the Thursday before Easter, and my very most favorite holiday for, religious purposes anyway. It's better church-wise than Christmas, better than Easter itself. It's just my favorite. I hadn't been in a lot of years, and I needed to go. I was embarking on this new chapter. I wanted to connect with God and connect with my grandmother, who's no longer with us, as that's a thing that we did together. So anyway, I walked into the church. I walked to the back, left-hand corner of the church, sat down, started to enjoy the praise music, looked up, was scanning the stage, and to my shock and horror, saw my rapist playing guitar in the praise band. Now, this man was a level 2 sex offender. He had been convicted of 4 counts of rape of a child, 14 and under. And I knew something had to be wrong. Something had to be wrong. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they okayed it, but something was wrong. I chose to stay at that service, which is one of the most powerful moments of my life. That seriously, that really just it was difficult, but it's one of the best things that I've ever done. Which you're gonna think I'm crazy, because when we went up for communion, I was as close to him as Heather is to me, and he did not make any attempts to, identify, but he also made no attempts to walk away or find another place to be, or divert his gaze. And I knew in that moment that he was going to jail, because I was told that I had a lifetime stay away order, a restraining order. At the end of that service, I obviously had to process, and I did. What I've learned is that trauma is the gateway drug. And so I've done a lot of somatic work in early sobriety and continuing into long-term recovery. And that includes yoga and breath work and just shaking it out, which is hysterical, Melanie, because I literally do this and I don't care how I look. I do not care how I look, guys. I care that my nervous system is regulated. So I went home and I regulated my nervous system. I had a hell of an emotional hangover the next day. But I was going to call somebody because something wasn't right. Didn't want to get the church in trouble, needed to accomplish the goal of figuring out how and why that guy was there, if he was supposed to be there, and having him arrested for violating the stay away order. Hello, buddy. Thank you.
Wants to give you some love.
So basically at that point, I called, I reported, I was told that they'd be on it, and I went on my merry way and waited for the system to do its work. Several months later, I had, completed a whole bunch of things I was trying to accomplish and was ready to see what was up with that. Called back and was told that nothing had been done. Not one single thing had been done. The officer that took the call was no longer with the department. So and here's where my sister's second situation comes in, I needed somebody better than the dispatcher or a random officer. And by better, I mean closer to power, closer to being able to do something, right? And the first person I thought of was Detective Sergeant Tim Brennan, who was on the Hopkinton Police Department then, and who had been at the time of my sister's second sexual assault that happened in Hopkinton at work. He was amazing with her. He is the only detective to sit down with her and go through things and not trigger her. And he was incredibly helpful to me when I called him. So I'm grateful for him and for that. We together spent the next 8 or 9 months trying to figure out what the laws were in this situation, trying to figure out, what the church knew, how this happened, trying to make sure it didn't happen again, and that policies and procedures were changed to ensure that would be a thing in perpetuity, as Heather said. And eventually, in May of 2023, he was ready to charge. this was for failure to register, though, because it turns out that I did not have a lifetime stay away order in the sense that they had promised. I had a lifetime stay away order in the sense that the lifetime of the case is the lifetime, right? So didn't know that, meaning I had been unprotected, just walking around for 2009 to 2022 or 3, right? That's a lot of years. A lot of years. Can't do the math right now.
The lifetime of the case is
right,
when.
Right.
When
So
does that end?
2009.
No, I know, but for other people, it ends when they're out of jail and off of parole.
Yes,
that's the end of the life of the case.
Yes, the life of the case is when they are completely done with everything. They've served. Thank you, Heather. They've served their sentence. They are not on parole. They are not on probation. Good to go. So, I also filed for a restraining order, and that was a process that I'll revisit in a moment. But first, what I'll say is that when I called to follow up on the failure to register charges, because the church did not know that he was a registered sex offender, he had come on during COVID, and the worship team leader at the time, they ended up letting go for reasons, and he was no longer there. They actually had a procedure written down, a policy of Corey and Sorry checking, but it wasn't done. So the church was all set. Detective Sergeant Brennan was supposed to file the charges. I called to follow up on that and was told that he had been suspended. And my heart dropped to my stomach, because why? Like, if this cop, who I know to be a stand-up man and one of the best sexual assault detectives I have ever had on a case, is dirty, then I will never trust anyone in law enforcement again. As it turned out, he had been let go for doing what he should have done and every other detective should do when there is a report against a member of his own department, a report of sexual assault. He went to the state police, and the state police investigated, and they charged his deputy chief, who at the time of the crime was a school resource officer, with rape for raping a 15-year-old, I believe, even on school grounds. Yeah. So basically, the department was pissed that Sergeant Brennan had gone outside the department like he's supposed to. And they let him go. 200 people showed up in support. The survivor of the crime did not show up to speak out against him. And I knew that he was being railroaded. Turns out that the chief of police in Hopkinton is best friends with the gentleman that was charged with the crime. Can't call him a gentleman. The person, the asshole, sorry, that was charged with this crime. And yeah, he was out for blood. So that guy was actually convicted, though, this summer and is now serving 7 years in prison. So it's not looking real great for dude's decision-making skills right now over in Hopkinton. I actually have a friend in Hopkinton that has a Facebook page, The Truth About Hopkinton. And we're going to work together to try and fix things over there. But I just want to give you like just a brief understanding of just the craziness that ensues. Just trying to figure things out, just trying to do run-of-the-mill stuff or things you've been told are going to be easy. They're not easy. They're not. They're routinely extremely, extremely hard.
Nothing but barriers.
Yes, nothing but barriers. And Heather and I like to say all the time that we're a special kind of stupid. Like, we're not special. All right. We're just survivors. It's incredibly difficult for us, but we're the special kind of stupid that is able to go about it anyway. You know, we're the special kind of stupid that will be patient and will go through each and every piece of this process, because when you follow the process and you don't get the desired results, and it's obvious that they have screwed you out of said results because that's the result you should have gotten, what are they going to say about it? Right? Can't. So we haven't skipped a single beat, not one. Every single layer, we're going through it. It's not easy. So I say all that to say, slow and steady wins the race. And for me, the next 3 years of my life has been spent hunting down charges on 4 other failures to register that this gentleman had. One was at his primary residence. One was at his place of primary employment. One was a band that he plays out everywhere in. One was Berkeley School of Music. So in other words, he had failed to register not once, but 5 times across 3 different counties. 3 of those were in Worcester County. And that's when I learned that the magistrate system here in Massachusetts is something. It is the great smokescreen of the Massachusetts justice system, to quote the Boston Globe. And that's definitely a story for another day. So I will just move forward.
We're going to need a part 2.
Yeah. So anyway, slow and steady wins the race. So what you got to do is you got to prioritize self-care. And for me, Heather has helped me a lot with self-care. We tend to have like opposite like coping mechanisms, and we share them with each other. And what works for her seems to work for me, and vice versa. You know, I've learned a lot from, sad to say, Facebook Reels. I've intuited a lot, but what I knew is that I needed to make sure that my nervous system stayed as regulated as possible. And, you know, I've been doing my best to do that. Surrounding yourself in community is always a good idea. The ADA is not your lawyer. I just want to repeat that. The ADA that is prosecuting your rape case is not your lawyer. You are a witness in the state's case. So, as you've seen with the survivors of Epstein, you may want to hire your own attorney. You just might. Government doesn't always work to your best interest, as we've seen with Heather. You may want to hire an attorney in civil proceedings. I had to pay $3,000 for a lawyer to get a restraining order against my rapist, because the statute is written in a way that you have to go back in to the law library, look in the case law to see what it really means and what is actually enforceable and what is actually the thing you have to prove, which is that you are still traumatized by seeing your rapist. And I think that's true always for every survivor. So I'm pretty sure that should be written into the statute, because small town judges do not have the time to go into case law on a restraining order. And it's actually an HPO, a harassment prevention order, but we won't go into detail on that. So in the case of a civil issue, they do have pro bono clinics like Heather is working with. She's currently working with Harvard Cyber Law Clinic, and they did say we could plug them to get her records from the city and everywhere else. And I think it's saying something that they took her case. And I think it's saying something else that she hasn't gotten results yet. Still. The other thing to look out for, because I believe that people should go into this process with their eyes wide open. I went into this process thinking one thing, experienced over and over and over again the complete opposite of that, and it was incredibly traumatizing. I know now that had I known what I know now, it would have reduced the trauma significantly. And I had a good advocate, guys. These laws are complicated, they are nuanced, they are often not even prosecuted. So it takes a lot. It just takes a lot. You got to prepare for a wild ride. Like, you really just got to prepare for a wild ride. The statute of limitations is an issue in this state. We're told that for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, it's a lifetime. It is not a lifetime, because after 27 years, you need corroborating evidence. And we were recently told by the DA we met with, as Heather was discussing, that corroborating evidence is basically a video. Not even a witness in the case law so far qualifies as a corroborating witness, like, or a piece of evidence rather. Another victim might, we're not quite sure, but 27 years basically, guys, is the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. It starts at 16 or the age that you reported. That is not cool. It's even less cool for adult women who have 15 years total, 15 years to report. There was a bill at Capitol Hill a while back that was trying to address that. Hopefully they're going to have another one. That's something we really need to address. The right to notification for parole, for release, for things that are going on with your offender often doesn't happen. I was not notified when my offender was up for parole. I was not notified when he was released. I was not notified when he put in a petition to reduce his sex offender level from level 2 to level 1. And that was made possible by a law and an interpretation of the law that changed in 2020, where the burden of proof is now on the state to prove with almost a reasonable doubt that beyond almost a reasonable doubt that the offender is going to reoffend. Whereas prior it was on the offender to prove with a preponderance of evidence that he would not reoffend. That has resulted in so many people going in to get their, relevelings, and he was unfortunately leveled down to a level 1. And even though all of these crimes, the failures to register, happened prior to that leveling, and he most likely would not have been releveled had they seen them, that does not count as something that you can go back and appeal on. So just know that. The leveling laws changing also resulted in a person like my sister's offender, who luckily was scheduled for deportation at the end of his sentence, to be labeled a level 2. And trigger warning, I'm going to say something graphic, but it's necessary. He sodomized a 12-year-old at knife point with a 16-year-old accomplice. He then ran from the police for 2 years and was apprehended by America's Most Wanted. Level 2 sex offender, guys. It was only one 12-year-old. I've had actual conversations with SORB. SORB is incredibly underfunded. The way SORB is now, we should either get rid of it or fund it, because we have illusion of safety with SORB the way it is right now. That can be a whole 2-hour podcast. So just know sex offender registry laws and requirements are not what you think. And lastly, what I'll say is they are not prosecuted. The failures to register are not prosecuted. I believe This Week in Worcester will have a story for more detail on that very shortly, but that is what I have learned in the last 3 years. They go to magistrate. The magistrate then, and I've spoken to an actual clerk magistrate too, which I was so pumped to have this explained to me by that man. Basically, the magistrate takes a look, and even if the offender says, yes, I sure did fail to register. And mine did in several occasions. How long ago did it happen? Was there any harm caused? And have you fixed it? If the answer to all 3 of those questions is yes, they do not get charged. We looked it up recently. There was maybe 3 failures to register charged in the state in the time frame we were looking at. The only time you are charged for failure to register is if you don't register at all. So on your birthday, you have to register. If you don't register at all and the police become aware of that, they come out and pick you up and put you in cuffs and bypass the magistrate, and you are charged. If you falsely claim your address and place of employment on the day that you have to go register, and they find out the next day that you lied, it's magistrate, like I just described. So in other words, it's a house of cards. It does not matter in any way, shape, or form. It's a problem. So yeah, local government is super important, guys, because obviously they are attached to your DA's office, which is attached to, at a state level, the AG. We can make the most impact here at a local level. It is incredibly frustrating to watch all of the evidence against the perpetrators in the Epstein scandal, okay, get away with it. We are seeing and hearing horrific things. Often they've been backed up by other men, right? Like, this is the most obvious child sex abuse scandal, right, I've ever seen. And we won't have any arrests. We won't. And that is incredibly demoralizing. But you know what? We can work on our local government to make sure that our local officials are taking care of business, to make sure they're even educated on what taking care of business looks like, because often they don't know. I met with several officers who had no idea how to go about trying to investigate and charge a sex failure to register that wasn't a full failure to register. My DA had never prosecuted one in Hopkinton. He did get off on a technicality, by the way, because the preacher could not verify the number of volunteer hours he was there. So he failed to register. He worked there and was paid. He also volunteered. They couldn't deduce the exact amount of hours, therefore it didn't meet the burden. So it doesn't matter though, guys, because it taught me a lot. And I am now going to work with Heather to put it out there for everyone, because no human being, screw women or women that are survivors, right? Not just us. No human being should ever have to go through that, ever. So yeah, basically, we're banding together and we're going to start a nonprofit to help people connect and get to the resources they need so that they can get rid of unhealthy coping mechanisms and replace them with healthy coping mechanisms and heal from their trauma. And it's a ripple effect. And that is essentially my time, guys. But I, alongside Heather and Heather alongside me, we've started a survivor support group. That was Heather's piece. I have decided, that I'm obviously going to work with her. I was originally going to do it on recovering addicts, but I felt that survivors of childhood sexual abuse was actually a better group, being that there are a myriad of unhealthy coping mechanisms that come from trauma. One of them is addiction. And trauma is the gateway to all of that. So we are planning to give people the access that my sister never had. I say my sister died from her trauma because she did. She did. And that was not for lack of access to treatment, period. There were several trips to rehab. Some of them were paid out of pocket. We were promised trauma-informed care. We did not get. Time and time and time and time and time again. And so instead of begging the system to work for us, we're going to create a system that works for us. A peer-led model that uses a verified list of trauma-informed care providers in every area. I'm talking down to your nail tech, because you can be triggered at a nail salon. Like, it's happened. I've seen it. And trauma looks, as Melanie, I'm sure, is going to go into, very different than a lot of us think. Very different than our leaders think, than our judges think, than our magistrates think. Also a story for another day. So yeah, be the change, guys. And I don't feel like a worthy vessel, but here I am trying to be the change. So give me grace, because I am all over the place. That's it. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Thank you, Lynn. So I have just had the privilege of meeting Heather and Lynn, and it's been about less than 2 weeks, I think. And so I'm just hearing more and more pieces of their story today. And just wow. They've been at this for quite a long time, haven't they? Um, I want to actually thank anybody who's like listening to this, because I know Amy and Lynn and Heather know this, of course, but I've written a little bit publicly, but this is the first time I tried to speak to the sexual assault like publicly ever. I haven't spoken to it. I've only, just been around comfortable people. I've written about it, and I'm a very good intellectualizer, but I actually had what Lynn pointed to, and I was having those moments where you just cannot think of what you were going to say. So that was the first try, just so you know. It's a very big, complicated story. It was public and stuff, but I just like listening to how clear Heather and Lynn are with their story. It just kind of blows you away. One quick thing, there is a therapeutic modality called TRE, traumatic release experiencing. what it stands for. And that's exactly what Lynn was talking about. It's just like literally just letting the energy out of your body. That's so, so helpful. If you noticed in their stories too, and I don't want to forget to say this, both Heather and Lynn said this, and I would say this, the survivors have to do all of the heavy lifting with all of these issues while you are maybe not sleeping as much, forgetful, feeling uncomfortable. And so it's a really difficult process that all three of us in different ways are trying to invite others into. Um, just to jump back on this for time's sake, because I just want to go over just a couple of things, and then we're going to talk about what the other things we can do. I know Lynn did touch on some of that. So basically, I would just like everybody here to ask themselves the question, how, where did you get your mental health understanding, right? Where did you learn about mental health? And for the clinicians in the room, that'll be a little bit different of an answer, right? But where did you get your ideas about, your physical and your mental health? Um, Unfortunately, if you are, of a certain age at all, a lot of our ideas of health and especially mental health have been debunked, especially by a huge explosion in the understanding of the biology of trauma. So I started to tell you a piece of kind of my origin orientation with understanding that like food, lifestyle, things like that were going to be impactful to your mental health, right? So I've been studying this for like 33 years, and I will unequivocally debate anybody on this. There is no division between your mental and physical health. You can go under toxic stress and trauma through social situations, through psychological situations, and it can completely cause physical disease in the body. And that's a huge conversation, and something that could is like a week-long training on its own at least. But if you look at here, you can experience trauma, top down or bodied up. And when I talk about this or try to like conceptually talk about it, I use the word, I'm not sure if it's completely visible, like your embodied metabolics is kind of what I'm speaking to when I reference that, because you can you can get an illness like a cold. And when we have a cold, our immune system kicks in and there's like an inflammatory response, right? When we know we can also have some grief and have sadness, and the physiology of some of those hormonal systems can also cause inflammation. So you can like experience the physicality of depression through a bodily entrance, like a virus. That inflammation will could make your mood feel depressed. It can also, you can have an experience that would create depression, stress and stuff like that, and get inflammation in your body. And that's just like a overly simplistic way of thinking about the reciprocity of these things. And it requires a huge understanding of multiple systems in the body. I did want to just like tap on that, because if you look at social media, it's nervous system, nervous system, nervous system. And there's so much more to it. Unfortunately, and this is Women's History Month, so let's really point out where some of the constructions of how we think about trauma were created. Um, Basically, some of the formative ways we've thought about trauma have been studies based on male experience and a lot more male authorities and practitioners and providers, right? So you've heard of the typical fight, flight, freeze, and a lot more people now are familiar with the fawn, the appease, right? So unfortunately, the human experience doesn't fit into Venn diagrams that easily. It makes for nice social media memes, but it's just so much more complicated than that. The entire history um, of females and more vulnerable people, but like females in almost every society has been, there's not a lot of matriarchies in the world, has been a subservience. And there's been a dependency for your very survival. So there's some stuff to do with epigenetics, which is too complicated to get into. But relational strategies can look like a variety of things. Doesn't mean appeasement. Like it's much, much bigger than that. So I just wanted to put that out there, and taking a peek and understanding the difference between an event and acute trauma. Like for me, I was assaulted once by my friend. That's it. And um, so that's an acute trauma. An acute trauma, car accident could be an acute trauma. Chronic trauma is the habitual abuse. And understanding that we're not like, oh, you know, pain is pain, harm is harm, but to understand it and to kind of acknowledge that stuff because chronic trauma does a lot to the physiology of the body. And then also chronic traumas tend to be less validated or seen, right? Or at least not at the time of the experience. And importantly, all of the reactions, so we have language in the DSM, it's called, a lot of disorders. Unfortunately, that's really, really problematic, and that's an entire another conversation. Um, you are a human being, and your responses are very orderly, and they're normative reactions um, to experiences in your human system. Just going to talk on just going to peek a couple of things to start thinking differently about trauma. When I wrote, so this first thing over here on, it'll be my right, is the construct of neural resonance, right? So it's interpersonal resonance. And this was actually what I based a lot of my thesis, the research on neurobiology at that time, which has phenomenally exploded since then, in 15 years, right? So this is the capacity for one person's nervous system to influence and attune to another's emotional and physiologic states through mechanisms like we have mirror neurons, that's the most well known. We have a lot of other parts of our body. We have 40,000 heart neurites, we have neurons in our heart. And this gets into like, quantum physics and things like that, but we experience each other. So when Heather was telling her story about, we do teach about consent, right? We teach about these things in this cognitive way, and that's so important. But also, young people, we have an ability, intuition is what's most commonly thought of, but we have the ability when somebody's smiling, you can tell they're mad. A little kid is going to say, wait, why are you mad, even if you're smiling? But as adults, we learn, oh, wait, no, don't ask that question, even if you can kind of sense some things off. It's a little simplistic way to put it, but this is so important because of the, like, I'm going to say this from the harm point of view, because your disrupted system make, makes it harder for you to trust your own your own intuition and your own sense of your experience in the world. Okay. Because a lot of trauma survivors are running away from feeling the body. That's the dissociation. So your interoception is your ability to experience inside your body. Exteroception is outside. But proprioception is like your ability to feel your body in space. This becomes super important in trauma because you might find yourself bumping into a lot of things. Right? When you disconnect from the body, you find trauma survivors will be accident prone, right? Um, just to touch on like a handful of things. These things, neuroception is something that was coined by Stephen Porges, who came up with polyvagal theory. This is probably one of the most well-known biological components in like in more of the talk clinical therapy space. Unfortunately, and you can look at it just came out in February because he's been being challenged for years. He didn't get some of the anatomy right, but the concept is still really important, so it's still useful. Um, so your parasympathetic system is your rest and relax, digest system. The autonomic are the things that go, without our conscious like effort, like like breathing. We do it without conscious effort. Sympathetic is your fight or flight, your adrenaline, right? So this is really important, and I like to just sneak it in, even if it's just a tiny piece of a thing of a presentation, because if you've experienced trauma, one of the things that you can help yourself to do to be able to quickly regulate, we think of things like meditation, breath work, and all sorts of embodiment things. But increasing your HRV, your heart rate variability, can actually make you able to regulate yourself better. So if you're in a place where you're not too depressed, and some people get to situations where they're really not there to be able to get out there and exercise and like get the heart rate up. And movement is just really the most important thing, but getting your heart rate up and improving that can make you able to regulate in emotional moments, right? It's all super connected. Um, I didn't put a brain on this slide, but I did want to really touch on this because it's such an important part of all of this. The after effects of trauma from a variety of traumas, but sexual assault, it's very common in domestic violence and sexual assault to develop addiction. But in its most core essential understanding of what we know about like the body and the psychology of addiction. Well, let's start with the biology. So the same part of your brain that experiences emotional pain and processes that is the same part of your brain that experiences physical pain. So what that looks like in the real world is if you've had a lot of childhood trauma or you've been through some very extreme traumas, and you haven't been able to kind of recover your physiology. And by the way, it doesn't completely necessarily go away. You kind of get recalibrated. You can definitely heal. Don't ever believe anybody who says you can't. What healing, you get to define what healing is too, by the way. But back to what I was saying. You, oh my God, I did it. I did it. I did the blank out. Excuse me, I'm having one of those moments where I lost what I was saying there.
You're doing so great, Melanie. Don't think twice about it. You were just talking about the brain.
Right? And my brain just
Oh,
like it broke off.
And
Um,
addiction and heart rate
yeah,
variability.
heart rate
so
variability. That was, woo,
that's okay.
sorry.
I was actually ending with the heart rate variability. So I like these just if I'm not teaching a lot on the biology, I like to pique people's interest in like the different understandings of these kind of things. So the bottom one over here, and this is partly just to add an extra little yay for Women's History Month. That's Dr. Candace Pert, and she is just not well known enough, in my belief. So she is actually in the 1970s was a graduate student, and she discovered the opioid receptor in the brain. She worked for years for the NIH. A man took credit and got an award for the discovery, and she is a different kind of woman from the 1970s. She did not tolerate, or in, she's just a different kind of perfect person in science, rather, excuse me, because in science, like you just know if you're a graduate student, and like there's a practice of stealing students' work, whatever. But she didn't tolerate it. He won an award for her work, which he told her to go in a different direction, and she stubbornly went in the other one. And so she kind of had a very controversial career for being outspoken. But why I wanted to add her in here. So she actually was somebody who discovered that we have a physiological basis to what we interpret as emotions. There are these things called peptides. And so what a peptide is, you've probably heard of like Ozempic and all that stuff. So peptides are just partial chains of the strings of amino acids that make up a complete protein, right? So they're like those. And in our body, if we look at these little magnets that I have down at the picture, we think about electricity. Your nervous system is the electricity, and these molecules and these peptides in different parts of your body, especially they're finding more and more. They're looking a lot more at something called fascia, which is like, your lymphatic system, but it's like all of the in between supporting all your structure that are holding these. And you think about the molecules of emotion are kind of like directing the electricity. It's like so conceptually, it's kind of a fun way to think about these pieces because it reminds us there's a physiological component to all of this. We can't just think our way through trauma. And importantly, if I was going to go into the brain a little more, when we're emotionally hijacked, hopefully this is a well known enough. You can't be in your executive function, which is your frontal lobe, which is right up here. And I know we just do not have a crazy amount of time. So this is just, an incomplete list of just very normal reactions after sexual trauma. To be tired, exhausted. Toxic stress does so much to your system. You very likely to be more reactionary with mood swings. Anxiety is you almost always present, right? Heightened startle response, insomnia, dissociation is enormous in sexual trauma, and that is a really difficult thing for a person themselves to understand and know what's happening. One of the signs that has really helped people notice if they're dissociating is losing time. You lose time. You're like, you forget what you did the day before. If anybody remembers what it was like in COVID, when we were all like locked down and people's time got messed up, it's kind of like that, if that makes sense, right? Shame is all over the place. And I want to get to another slide because that's just the biggest part of sexual assault after effects, psychologically, self-doubt, body aches, it's normal. The way our stress response works in all of the different systems is, there's so much synergy in your system. It it's a cascading effect that is not understood like in terms of the severity, if you live under chronic trauma, so chronic sexual, like childhood sexual abuse, you're going to have an entirely different calibration to your body. We know that a female will probably menstruate years earlier. It does different things to the body. Um, and as Lynn mentioned, misuse of substances is huge. Short-term memory disruptions is very, very common for months after major trauma. Autoimmune diseases are like an epidemic, and they have exponentially increased in the past like 40 years. But for women, but the numbers not in my head exactly right now, but it's like three times fold for women of color, and then the increase for women, white women, was like, I don't know, it was like seven times. I've got to look at the numbers again. I haven't looked that up in a minute, but it's significant. And that's not a difference in our species, our human species. It has to do with societal pressures and disruptions. So I'll just give you one example. Diabetes seems like a disease that's not really related to trauma, right? Unless maybe you have an emotional eating thing, right? But that's not how it works. Our bodies are so synergistic. So our insulin is a hormone, if people don't know that, right? Your pancreas gives insulin when you gives you know gives insulin when you put glucose in your body, so that's like carbohydrates or food, so that it can break it down. But your pancreas also, your cortisol levels actually release glucose from your liver and your muscle. So even if you haven't eaten anything, you have chronically high cortisol levels, you're getting these huge spikes in your blood of glucose, which is like eating sugar. If you're living under chronic stress, you could be eating a better diet than somebody else who doesn't get diabetes. So like that's just a very grounded way to kind of understand some of this stuff. So on the leaf here, these are just, a soft scrape of some things that are very supportive, have been proven over and over. Movement and like make it fun. Like that word exercise is like so associated with have to, that like everybody I talk to, any client, just move. Like move for fun too. Don't like the external bully who has to like force yourself to do something. And especially movement that like gets you in your body, that maybe isn't you like being robotic in your body and pushing it, is probably the most healthy to flow. I love yoga. I'm a yoga teacher. I've been for many years. Um, Being in nature, I mean, not just for the physical experience, the sun, but also like even in like putting your bare feet into the earth is it's very grounding. There's a great exchange of ions, and even just the bacteria. It like helps our microbiome. Our happy chemicals like serotonin, like 95% of that is in our gut. That old idea that you have a chemical brain imbalance has been completely disproven for a very, very long time. You have more, your neurotransmitters are more affect a lot. The ones you need the most for mental health are heavily associated with your gut, which is heavily associated by your nutrition. Um, so we can see here that there's a lot of more and less difficulty for people to recover. If you look at this list, depending on class status, parenting responsibility, all sorts of things. So remembering survivors are doing this while they are having to maintain all their responsibilities as well, right? And taking the time for a lot of these things. When you go through a lot of chronic trauma, you burn through nutrients faster. And that really isn't something that's talked about. You can really blow through certain kinds of nutrients, and certain nutrients can be missing that could be affecting your mood and could really help your support. Um, could help support your recovery rather, right? So this is for me, and just take a few more minutes with this slide and the next, and then we'd have some time for discussion. This conversation is the conversation I would like everybody to explode. Okay. When I learned, so this is 20, when I learned the that prosecutors do not want female adults on juries with female victims of sexual assault, I was just like jaw dropped for a couple of minutes, and then I was like, oh, okay. If I have to, if somebody discloses that they've been assaulted, right? And they disclose to a person who knows the perpetrator, the harmed, right? That person has to negotiate a sense of unsafety in the world. They feel vulnerable because, wait, I thought that was a good person. We have these ideas that people are good or bad, and in mainstream society, and we are all a lot of things. But oh, I feel safe in the world when I can trust my judgment, when I'm right. So if I'm wrong about that person, then I'm not safe in the world. And how do I know? How do I know who anybody really is? It feels very ungrounding and vulnerable and unsafe, right? And we do a lot to compensate to feel safe, psychologically, physically, all the things. Similarly, it's the same dynamic that keeps an extra layer of shame on survivors. Um, because you have to feel like there's something you could have done, right? Like, I should have this, that, there's got to be a reason. And almost all victims are not, there's usually not there's perfect victims. There's people have to find a reason to have a problem with the victim. They have to victim blame because they don't want to feel vulnerable in their own experience. The need for safety, that I can trust my judgment, I can trust the people that I think are trustworthy, that is so core to feeling that basic survival um need to feel like you have some kind of agency over your environment, right? I think this is a conversation that just really should elevate and grow, because this piece of it, in my own witnessing of like the justice system and the work that I do, is so core to us being unwilling to create effective legislation and to create different protocols and practices. Because, yeah, it just sets off so many things within us that the world is just, completely anarchy or something. There we go. And so this is just the last page before we open some time for discussion. Basically, patriarchy is permission for power over, right? The permissions of power are enormous, as we're witnessing the most grotesque permissions of power, as I think, Heather and Lynn both mentioned the Epstein, and it's in your face all the time. And I think survivors who engage with the system aren't really surprised about the level of like predation and stuff. Some of the sadism maybe, but that micro version of misuse of power, of some people doing whatever they want and getting away from it, is in all sorts of communities. It's everywhere, and that's those similar dynamics of a lack of accountability. As you saw, very few perpetrators of assault are held accountable. So, couple of things to think about. I have these words over here, and this is just a personal thing. I use the word trauma informed because it's what most people use, but I prefer trauma responsive. All of the studies have shown this whole idea of like understanding trauma has exploded. When I started studying this in 2013, they were doing hit jobs on the rock stars now. Like Gabor Mate, they did a hit job on him in like 2011, 13 or something in Psychology Today, what a quack he was. And so the entire respect for the trauma field has gone in an entirely different direction. Having any understanding that there's all this body stuff is just starting to really be unpacked. Um, yeah, so important to understand, traditionally existing now, there isn't the infrastructure in clinical programs. So it's only about 10% of therapists that are trained in psychological trauma. And again, they're not going to have the endocrinology, the cardiology, a lot of that extra biology stuff, right? So just being aware of that when you're seeking out a provider, like, you have to tell people you're specifically looking for somebody who has some trauma understanding and background. And, you know, preferably not just the somatic stuff, because it is so much more than that. I love Levine's work, but there's so much more. So, oh yeah. So if you think about the mental health field, is largely not deeply trained in trauma. It's not, again, it's not in the infrastructure. There are only there's only a trauma elective at 20% of graduate programs for mental health professionals, whether it's an LMFT or MSW, etc. So you can consider if they're not really deeply trained in trauma, neither are your police, prosecutors, judges, right? Um, they're going to continue these biases. So I'm going to jump down for a second to that hysterical woman in history thing. Um, if anybody knows, like, so part of the way I like to train about like how do we get to these beliefs? So you have to understand kind of like where we got in our health beliefs. We could have been a century ahead understanding trauma in the body if not for the permissions of power. So Freud, for anybody familiar with his work, his his work on uncovering that all of the women that he was treating had sexual abuse histories, and he thought that that's what their hysteria was, right? He was pretty sure. And when he started writing and talking about it, he got pushback from the powerful Vienna men of the time. So he retracted. But at the end of his life, he then conceded again. He did believe they were all sexually abused, and that was the core of their physiologic distress, right? Um, so denying body violation, ignoring what is actually factually true, and has a long history when it comes to who gets to define, wellness, harm, health, all of those things. So I'm going to jump back up here for a sec. No, yeah, so no, just above that, there it says Buck v. Bell. Buck v. Bell is a Supreme Court case that I use often. Um, this court case, which is 1 century ago, legalized forced sterilization of mostly low-income white women at the time. It was out of the eugenics movement, actually. So this is we've got the eugenics movements going on. For any of you kind of familiar, it's very topical. In 1924, we passed an Immigration Reform Act because of the different immigrants and racial prejudice. So there was obviously a serious effort. It was the Jim Crow, it's complete segregation for races, and then they wanted to prune out the undesirables. So there was something like 70 to 80,000 white women forcibly sterilized as a result of this case. So they manufactured a case. Don't want to get into it too much. It's an interesting story, but Carrie Buck was a young girl who was adopted because her mother was put in feeble and epileptic in asylum, which was what they were psychiatric hospitals back then. Her mother was put in the psychiatric hospital for for syphilis and promiscuity. So literally in the confines of this is a case from Virginia at the time. In this time, you could be labeled promiscuous if you were a girl who passed a note to a boy in a class. And what was happening was the doctors, we class differentials, were forcibly sterilizing women without their knowledge, and they wanted to protect themselves from malpractice. So they manufactured this case. Carrie was raped by the brother of the family that adopted her, and so she then became promiscuous. And so she became a court, the ideal candidate for a court case, and it ended up in the Supreme Court decision with them deciding that sterilization, that 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. That's Oliver Wendell Holmes, very respected in law circles. Hitler used this court case as part of justification for the Holocaust, obviously, just as a little side note. So I bring that up, and it seems probably a little unrelated, but permission over bodies is all over the place. And that is such a heavy lifting cultural, like in ubiquitous cultural problem that is tangled up in us getting any kind of decent legislative common sense reforms. Power dictates the social construction of law. You can watch laws get reversed. Anybody who knows Citizens United that was passed in 2010, there was a legal precedent prior to that when there were different justices on the court. I think it was about 15 years earlier. I'd have to look at the case law again that determined that money was not speech, right? It's who's in power, who interprets the law, who executes the law that determines justice or, justice quite quotably. Couple other quick things. Our system right now actively abuses sexual assault survivors, unquestionably. As I love what Lynn said. We don't have a justice system. We have a legal system, and that is so on point. the practice of somebody coming in and reporting, a lot of time they treat you like you're a suspect. Now, that is a huge problem for trauma and memory, right? So when you have a huge big trauma like that, you don't necessarily remember everything in linear fashion. So, like, you don't remember it in the chronology it happened. And sometimes things don't come back till over time. And that is very common with sexual assault, super extra common when there are substances, etc. So, that use of the read technique is an actively abusive practice that is just all over this country. And then the other thing I want people to understand is there is a substantial charging of young college age 18 to 24-year-old women. They tend to be lower income with false reporting, right? They come in alone, confused. There was a girl who spent a year in jail, and there was an investigative report done, and there's this documentary victim suspect. This is down in Connecticut, Sacred Heart. And as she spent a year in jail, and this investigative reporter was looking into this issue, this is a couple of years back, and finds out that the detective on the case never bothered to look up the two perpetrators that she said had assaulted her at a college party. One of them had been accused by another woman 1 month before. She was charged with false reporting and put in jail. Now, the way the traumatized brain works, especially for a young person, is like that's overwhelming. She's in shock. She can't remember everything. So if somebody's trying to punch holes in her story when she's just barely able to grasp it herself because she's just been assaulted by two boys, that is how she can be convinced that, oh, nothing really bad happened is very understood in the science. So I don't know if that's clear, but it's a huge conversation. There's a lot of these kinds of practices and protocols that need to change. So just for more time, there's legislative reforms of just the soft scrape of some initial things. There should be no such thing as NDAs around any kind of issue of sexual violence, sexual harassment, or sexual assault. They're tools of power. Mandated training is obviously necessary. Obviously, Lynn just spoke a lot about the sex offender registry boards. So I think this is a huge problem. Mandate that SA statistics be publicly available by DA's office, because a lot of times what they're doing is they're just closing out a case, right? So they're only, what is it? Was that stat 5% of reported cases? No, I'm sorry. Only 50 cases out of 1,000 out of the 300 that get reported, only 50 cases lead to any form of arrest, right? So the weeding out process, there's a lot of protocols and practices that can be changed. But we don't even have the statistics of how many people reported and what cases were pursued and not pursued and why. We don't have good numbers on that. Also, a right to review board. If I know in my case, I was told I had a strong case, and then I walked in and had to hear this like ridiculous stories that I could have, like, I could prove some of the things weren't true, but she was like, no, no. I wrote up to my boss and nope. And I was like, I really want, like, you can have my therapy, like, I got nothing to hide here. What is this? And no, and she, like, it's a long story, but there should be a review. It should not be up to a single person who doesn't want to argue a case because there's some new bumps in it, right? It really shouldn't, there shouldn't be that much power in determining, because in my case, I didn't say a lot about it. It was a hugely complicated thing, but he got fired. He actually lost some like of his standing. So there was a consequence for him. And I'll leave it on this because this is a big part of the difference in the two stories you just heard. As a 42-year-old woman with a deep understanding of trauma. Now, there was a couple things about the dynamics of sexual trauma I was not familiar with. That was not my focus at all. My focus is systems, the body, biology, and understanding like the history of it all, right? I do not know how young people like that system would like I'm a strong like I, I was displaced from domestic violence, lived in 8 places in 2 years, got out, had to argue a court case because unfortunately I could because I had my undergrad degree from government. I went a scholarship there, and I was able to do that. But like I had to do that, and I had to deal with a sixth grade teacher for my son that was horrific. I have had a huge amount of capacity. If I ever had to deal with the criminal justice system with sexual assault when I was like 20, it would have broken me. And like I was tell you, there's a lot in my life why I became a trauma educator. Like I watched my mom have a permanent psychotic break. There's been so many things in my life. Engaging with the justice system as a 42-year-old educated I'm white. I have all sorts of those kinds of advantages. The only thing I didn't have was a bunch of class advantage, right? It wouldn't have been easy for me to have a lawyer present and to afford that at that moment. Um, and it would have broken me. So, that's I think that's an extra reason why I am just floored by Lynn and Heather's stories and having to contend with this because there are significant differences in different ages and stages of developmental trauma, right? We don't want to like get too heavy into like people get impacted differently. Somebody who might have been impacted as a child but had like knew everybody around them would believe them if they told them even if they didn't tell, they probably might have a different experience than somebody who did tell and wasn't believed or who didn't think they'd be believed. There's just a lot of layers to how we are individual in these experiences. And I am going to leave it there because I realized I did go on a bit. Are we going to open up for
Was so great,
discussion now?
Melanie. That was so important. Everything you said was so important. And it's so clear that we really can use a part two on this one. But we don't have a lot of time. And if people are willing to stay later, then we do. But I'd love to, if you want to stop the screen share and we just hear from people
Yeah,
if they
I'm working
have
on it
questions
now. There we
or
go.
comments or and I so appreciate how supportive everybody's been in the chat. Like there's so much love coming at Lynn and Heather and Melanie. That's so deserved. And we're just so grateful for you to be here, to be witness to this. Tanisha, so great to see you here and hear from you. Hop on.
Hi, Amy,
Dr.
thank you for,
Tony.
yes, thank you for inviting me and thank you, everyone for telling your story. I am a survivor of not one, not two, not three, not four, but five sexual assaults by a total of eight people over my life, not including my ex-husband, where that was domestic violence. Yes, Amy, I've been through some stuff and you know some, but I have been through some stuff. And I do have a PhD in criminal justice and in criminology, and I have been an advocate in various fields since I was 12. So, thank you so much for what you do. But I also want to, I guess, ask this because you never know who's listening. And I've been one of those people listening. And we hear about all the challenges that you faced. And those are real. And I, for a fact, know that you are leaving out a lot. The challenges are enormous. But I also don't want those of us listening to be dissuaded from reporting because there is power in reporting. So I'm just curious about when you finally spoke up or when you began to fight the system and the powers within it, what empowerment did you get from that so that if someone is listening, they don't say, well, they went through that, I don't want to report. Um, you seem to each kind of tell a story of how you had that kind of moment. So I'm just curious.
That's a great question. I'll use my sister as an example. So my sister, that second sexual assault that she suffered at the hands of her boss, she went to trial and went through the process with that. And at a judge trial, he was convicted not of the sexual assault, but of the physical assault when he was holding her down to commit the sexual assault. So in other words, she lost that case. And I had been the one that pushed her to go in and report because obviously she was terrified having been through the process before. Years later, I asked her, if she regretted reporting. I told her I felt guilty for pushing it due to the result, right? She said, no, I don't regret it, not at all. I would do it again. These guys, their names need to be spoken, their crimes need to be out in the open. And so I hope that answers the question. Everybody's different. I just say go in eyes wide open, find a good advocate, find a friend that's been through it. If you got nothing else, do some internet research. Our resources will hopefully be
Yeah,
good
don't
too.
go in alone.
Yeah.
That like have somebody you trust, even if you like even if you don't have somebody who's like a therapist friend or whatever. I mean, you can find professionals. Any of us are available, but get someone you trust because you're gonna go in there and it's like I don't the way that I just first told my story like publicly, my memory was not as sharp as I normally am when I'm teaching. This has been a little harder for me because it's the first time I'm talking about the assault. Everything else I've been teaching to and for years, it's easy. But that happens, and then you just were interviewed for a couple of hours, and you're like, wait, what did they say? What happened? And then in my personal experience, like I had to deal with DV stuff before and an awesome victim advocate that was there and I was brand new to all that stuff. The victim advocate that was there in my second ADA meeting was useless. She didn't say a word to me. She didn't smile at me. I sat there and advocated for myself. The most kindness I got was from the male detective. I don't for a second think he didn't believe me. His hands were tied, but like my advocate, did nothing. So just don't do it alone. Yeah.
Yeah, I would 1,000% echo what you just said, Melanie. Don't do it alone. Just have someone that you trust. Like I said, when I was interviewed by DSS the first time, as a 13-year-old trauma survivor, it was terrifying to like the people that I disclosed to. I had months and months and months worth of knowing them and trusting them before I got up the courage to say anything. So definitely have somebody go with you. And I don't think that I regret disclosing. I regret how I was treated. I regret what happened afterwards. I don't regret it, but I'm sad about it. I'm whatever. But I would still do it because I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't be in a position where I could potentially write a roadmap for people to get their files or, do all these things. And even when I get discouraged, I'm like, I have to keep going. I have to keep doing this because I have all the privileges, right? And I have pro bono lawyers, and everybody deserves that. Everybody. So I want to keep going so that I can give all of those resources to other people. And so I don't regret that at all. At all. It is traumatizing, I think, to deal with the legal system, but obviously they're really great people. The head of the sexual assault unit at the Worcester Police Department right now, which, believe me, there's no love lost between me and the Worcester Police Department, but this guy was great. And his detective that we also met with was fantastic. Like, there are great people in the legal system. Unfortunately, it's just not the majority of them.
And the system is rigged against good people being able to do the things they need to do to get actual justice. Yeah. So
100%.
Thank you so much for that. And the system is definitely rigged in so many different ways. So I'm with you on that one. But thank you so much for that. Sometimes even after you go through it, it's good to hear I don't regret it. So I've been through it. So I just want to applaud you all again. Keep doing what you're doing. You're so necessary. You're so needed. And thank you for choosing life.
Oh, thank you.
Back to
Thank you
you.
so much.
Back to you. Thank you. Wow. Wow. Yeah.
That's kind of a beautiful bow to put on top of it. If there's no other questions, thank you for choosing life is like such a beautiful sentiment to end with. And it is 2:06. It does seem like I'm feeling like we are going to need a part two. It seems like there's just so much really important content here. That needs to keep being talked about, keep being heard. We love it if you do check out the website where you can see Heather and Lynn have posted about their new nonprofit. They're launching a Give Butter to try to get some funding to do this work. They've been doing it for free. They've been doing it because they care about it. And so and they're also open if you work for an org and you'd love to have them come and talk to you. This is why we're doing this. We want these stories to get out. I learned so much today, and I don't think people in the general public recognize all the barriers against people that were harmed. It's not okay. And the only way to change it is to keep on hammering home what this is. It's huge.
I'd just like to add one thing is that we don't know everything. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of things we don't know. And there's so much knowledge in this Zoom right now. So if y'all have knowledge that you want to share with us, we're also totally open and would be thrilled to hear that. Because we are under no illusions that we know everything we need to know about this.
Not even close.
So,
But don't let them like self-deprecate too much because I've already learned a few things from these amazing women and you know, like the directions I didn't know. So I may also plug this too, Amy. So I'm starting a nonprofit called Just Us for Survivors with the sole purpose of educating in the dynamics of sexual assault, but changing legislation. So the thing that I will spend the rest of my life working on, however long it takes, is to outlaw NDAs in case, like the only useful and the only use for an NDA is for proprietary interest in business. Other than that, they are a tool of power. They are a tool to silence somebody or exert power over another human being. And we need to end that kind of hierarchy, right? So that and the training part, but that NDA part is going to be a huge thing. So I am in the process of just trying to fundraise seed money, get things going, and I am still looking for board members. If anybody's interested in that. So I'm in the middle of kind of getting that going, and I look forward to continuing to do anything I can to support Heather and Lynn. And oh my God, the unreal situation over there in Worcester. I learned a lot about Worcester recently. Whew.
Oh yeah, it's bad.
Good time over here.
Bad.
We have a lot to learn from you too, Melanie.
Oh, so much. So
Melanie,
excited.
your content was amazing. Thank you
So
so much. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, everybody, for being here and for still being here. 2 hours and 10 minutes.
Right.
You are the best people ever. So grateful to have men in our audience that are doing this work, that care about women. We are just so super grateful. Pathways to Change was well represented here. Absolutely. And Pathways for Change did a great Trauma Training Tuesday in the past. Yeah, we hope we're just going to keep on creating these resources, and we are so grateful. We'll post your flyers about Denim Day. Absolutely. Yeah, please stay in touch with us, and thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.